June 13th, 1864. Somewhere along the Richmond and York River Railroad, Virginia, men are doing something no training manual has ever covered. They are writing their names on slips of paper and pinning them to the inside of their coats. Not letters home, not final words for their families, just their names. A name, a unit, sometimes a state, pinned to the inside of their uniforms so that when the order comes, the order everyone can already feel building in the morning air like a storm. Whoever finds them on the ground will know who they are. They are about to attack Cold Harbor. The men doing this are not cowards. They are veterans, men who have been fighting since 1861. They have survived the Wilderness and Spotsylvania and a dozen smaller engagements in the last month alone. They have watched their regiments shrink from 1,000 men to 400 to 200. They know exactly what is on the other side of that open ground. They have been asking their officers to call off this assault for days. The order does not get called off. At 4:30 in the morning, they go over the top. Within minutes, some accounts say 7, some say less than 10, but the bottom line, roughly 6,000 to 7,000 Union soldiers are dead or wounded in the initial assault. The attack is so catastrophically brief and so catastrophically costly that reporters struggle to write about it. The men who survive return to their trenches and refuse, for one of the first times in the war, to obey orders to attack again. And the name attached to the decision that sent them forward, the name that will have to answer for those few minutes, is Ulysses S. Grant. This is the story of 1864, the year that nearly destroyed him, the year of the butcher, the year of the newspapers, the casualty lists, and the politicians who shook their heads and said the wrong man had been chosen. The year he nearly lost his career, his reputation, and the confidence of a president fighting for his own political survival. It is also, paradoxically, the year that won the war. A lot of behind-the-scenes work goes into every script, animation, and edit you see here. If you're enjoying the results, hit subscribe to join the journey. It's the best way to support the team. Also, dropping a like tells us exactly what kind of history you want to see next. Let's jump back in. To understand how Grant ended up at Cold Harbor, you have to go back to March 1864 when everything looked completely different. In the spring of 1864, Ulysses S. Grant is the most celebrated military figure in the United States. He has just been appointed General-in-Chief of all Union armies, the first officer to hold that rank since George Washington. He has earned it in a way no one in the Eastern Theater has managed. He took Fort Donelson. He survived and rallied at Shiloh when other commanders would have broken. He captured Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863, splitting the Confederacy in half and opening the entire Mississippi River to Union control. He broke the Confederate grip at Chattanooga in November 1863, driving Braxton Bragg's army from what had seemed an unassailable position on Missionary Ridge. He has won repeatedly, decisively, in ways the generals in the East, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, Meade, have consistently failed to do. Now Lincoln is bringing him east. Northern newspapers can barely contain their excitement. One paper writes that Grant is now so powerful and so trusted that he could compel the administration to obey him rather than he them. Another promises that with Grant in supreme command, the Army of the Potomac will finally deliver quick work and great results. The North has been waiting for 3 years for a general who can finish it. Grant, the papers agree, is finally him. He arrives in Washington in March 1864. He meets Lincoln for the first time. He is 41 years old, 5'8", slightly rumpled, conspicuously unimpressive in the way that genuinely capable people sometimes are. He does not give speeches. He does not perform confidence. He just sits with maps and thinks. And what he designs is a plan of genuine ambition. The fundamental problem with how the Union has been fighting the war, Grant believes, is that its armies have been operating independently, one campaign in Virginia, another in Tennessee, another in the Gulf, giving the Confederacy the ability to shift forces from front to front wherever the pressure eased. The result is that no defeat is ever final. You can beat one Confederate army and watch its survivors show up somewhere else. Grant's solution is to apply pressure everywhere at once, simultaneously, so that no Confederate army can rest or reinforce another. In the east, Grant himself will go with Meade's Army of the Potomac and drive straight at Lee. In the Shenandoah Valley, Franz Sigel will push south, denying Lee the valley's farms and forcing the Confederates to split their attention. In Louisiana and the Gulf, Nathaniel Banks will strike along the Red River with an eye toward threatening Mobile and the Deep South. And in Georgia, William Tecumseh Sherman will go after Joe Johnston's Army of Tennessee, driving toward Atlanta. Crush the Confederacy at every point at once, squeeze until something gives. It is, on paper, the right strategy. Possibly the only strategy that can end the war in 1864 rather than 1865 or beyond. Grant moves his headquarters into the field with Meade's army and prepares to cross into Virginia. And then, almost immediately, the plan starts to come apart. Franz Sigel marches up the Shenandoah Valley and runs headlong into a Confederate force at New Market on May 15, 1864. The Confederates, in one of the war's most famous moments, include teenage cadets from the Virginia Military Institute. Boys pulled from their classrooms and marched into battle. Sigel's army, which outnumbers them, is routed anyway. Sigel retreats north. The valley remains in Confederate hands, still feeding Lee's army, still threatening Washington from the west. One arm of the vise is broken before it closes. In Louisiana, Nathaniel Banks leads the Red River Campaign toward Shreveport and watches it collapse into disaster. Union gunboats become stranded as the river falls before navigable levels. Confederate forces under Richard Taylor, Zachary Taylor's son, a man with no formal military training who is improvising brilliantly, defeat Banks at Mansfield and Pleasant Hill and send the Union army retreating back to New Orleans. Mobile, which Grant had wanted threatened, is never reached. The second arm is gone. 2 of the 4 major offensives Grant designed to end the war in one coordinated blow have collapsed within weeks of beginning. What remains is Sherman in Georgia, making methodical progress, but progress measured in miles and months, and Grant himself in Virginia, now carrying nearly the entire weight of breaking the Confederacy alone. He crosses into Virginia on May 4, 1864. What follows is something the war has not seen before. The Wilderness, May 5th to the 7th. A dense, tangled forest of second-growth trees and briars so thick that units lose contact with each other in the brush. Artillery is nearly useless. There are no clear fields of fire. The fighting devolves into close-range chaos, men shooting at muzzle flashes, sometimes firing into their own lines. Casualties mount on both sides with terrifying speed. And then, artillery sparks ignite the dried underbrush. The wilderness catches fire. Wounded men trapped between the lines cannot be rescued. Some of them burn alive. Their screams carry through the smoke to both sides. Grant keeps pushing forward. He is doing something no Eastern commander has done before. Every previous general who met Lee in Virginia and suffered heavy losses has pulled back, retreated north, regrouped, given Lee time to recover and reposition. Grant does not. After 2 days of brutal fighting in the wilderness, he moves around Lee's flank and marches south towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. When his men realize he isn't retreating, that he is moving south toward the enemy, some of them cheer, some of them cry. For 3 years, they have fought Lee and then pulled away. This feels different, but the cost of staying engaged is accumulating fast. Spotsylvania Courthouse, May 8th to the 21st. 12 days of fighting around elaborate Confederate earthworks. On May 12th, Grant throws 20,000 men at a bulge in the Confederate line called the Mule Shoe. They break through, capturing thousands of Confederate prisoners in one of the most extraordinary assaults of the war. But the hand-to-hand fighting that follows at the Bloody Angle lasts nearly 20 hours. Men stab at each other through gaps in long breastworks. Bodies pile 4 and 5 deep in the trenches. Grant moves around Lee's flank again. North Anna, May 23rd to the 26th. More fighting, more casualties. The Confederate defenses are too strong to crack directly. Grant moves around the flank again. On May 11th, near Spotsylvania, Grant writes to Henry Halleck in Washington, The line he chooses will become one of the most quoted of the war. "I promise to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." Northern newspapers print it as a banner of confidence. The public reads it as iron resolve, the promise of a commander who will not flinch, will not retreat, will see this through. But read those words again carefully. He is proposing to fight it out on this line all summer. More weeks of this, more casualty lists arriving in cities and towns across the north. More names, more families with holes in them. More of the grinding, relentless, costly fighting that is already straining the public's patience, beyond what most people imagined when they cheered Grant's appointment. By early June, the Army of the Potomac has suffered roughly 50,000 to 55,000 casualties in about 1 month of nearly continuous fighting. 50,000 men in 30 days against an enemy that has contested every mile. And then comes June 3rd. Cold Harbor is not a dramatic place. It is a crossroads, a name on a map, roads meeting southeast of Richmond in flat, unremarkable Virginia countryside. It is also the place where Grant makes the decision he will regret for the rest of his life. The logic of the assault is not entirely unreasonable. Lee's army has been fighting continuously for a month. It is exhausted, it is numbers thinning, its supply lines stretched. Grant believes, and some of his corps commanders believe, that one more concentrated blow might break the Confederate line and open the road to Richmond. If Richmond falls, the war could end in days, not months. But the men who will carry out the assault do not share this optimism. They have studied the Confederate position. The earthworks at Cold Harbor are among the most formidably constructed defenses of the war. Interlocking fields of fire, artillery positioned to sweep the open ground, infantry packed deep behind walls of earth and log. The approach is open, flat, and almost entirely exposed. Attacking across that ground is not a calculated risk. It is, as the soldiers can see with their own eyes, a near certain catastrophe. So they write their names on slips of paper, and they pin them to the inside of their uniforms. At 4:30 in the morning, the assault begins. Within minutes, accounts vary between roughly 4 and 10 minutes of sustained attack. The Union forces are shattered. In the opening phase of the assault, about 6,000 to 7,000 men fall. Over the full day's fighting around Cold Harbor, Union casualties reach around 12,000, while Confederate losses are a fraction of that number. The Confederate lines hold without breaking. Grant calls off the attack. For the next several days, wounded men lie between the lines in Virginia's summer heat. Soldiers on both sides can see them, can hear them calling for water, can watch some of them die slowly in the open ground between the trenches. Grant sends flags of truce, requesting permission to retrieve his wounded. Lee's response comes slowly, wrapped in military formalities and bureaucratic delay. By the time Union stretcher parties are formally permitted to enter the field, 4 days after the assault, most of the wounded have already died. In his memoirs, written 2 decades after while he is dying of throat cancer, Grant singles out Cold Harbor. He has made costly decisions throughout the war. He has ordered men forward and to fire dozens of times. But Cold Harbor is different. He writes that June 3rd is the one order in the war he most wishes he could take back. "I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made." Not Shiloh, where his army was nearly overwhelmed on the first morning. Not the Wilderness where men burned alive in the brush. Cold Harbor. That quiet admission, in a book written by a former president who spent decades being accused of callousness, tells you what Cold Harbor actually cost him. Not just in men. In something harder to replace. Northern newspapers, which have been watching the casualty lists grow all spring, find their verdict ready. The word they settle on is butcher. Before the Overland Campaign, Northern newspapers had described Grant as a kind of military messiah, the man who could finally end it. The paper that wrote about Grant's compelling the administration to obey him had not been exaggerating the public mood. There was genuine, most desperate faith in what he represented. After Cold Harbor, many of those same papers have a different story to tell. Grant is a butcher, a man promoted beyond his abilities, who has been hiding his mediocrity behind softer Confederate opposition in the West. Against Lee, real Lee, the tactical genius who has been outmaneuvering Union commanders for 3 years, Grant is, in this story, just another general who solves every problem by feeding men into a grinder. The older rumors resurface. His drinking, his resignation from the peacetime army under murky circumstances in 1854. The questions that had followed him before Vicksburg silenced them. Peace Democrats in Washington, who have been arguing for a negotiated end to the war all along, begin pointing at the casualty figures with barely concealed satisfaction. Here, they say, is proof that continuing the war is madness. 50,000 men in 30 days. And what does the Union have to show for it? A siege at Petersburg that looks, from the outside, exactly like every other stalemate the war has produced. More dangerously, they point at November. Lincoln is up for re-election. The likely Democratic candidate is George McClellan, the popular former general, the man Lincoln removed from command, now positioning himself as the peace alternative. If the war remains bogged down, if the casualty lists keep arriving with nothing decisive to show for them, if there is no clear victory before Election Day, Lincoln could lose. And if Lincoln loses, the new administration will almost certainly negotiate peace that recognizes Confederate independence, undoing everything the war has cost so far. Grant's military reputation and Lincoln's presidency are now locked together. One cannot survive without the other, and Grant has just handed the anti-war movement its most powerful argument. After the failed assaults at Cold Harbor, Grant makes a decision that is strategically sound and politically devastating. He crosses the James River, moves against Petersburg, the railroad hub that supplies Richmond, and settles into what will become a 9-month siege. The public does not see a sound strategic decision. The public sees trenches. The North has spent 3 years waiting for a general who can cut through the stalemate and deliver a clean, decisive victory. Grant has seemed to be that man. Instead, the summer of 1864 brings precisely the outcome the public dreads. The Army of the Potomac locked in trenches outside Petersburg, bleeding slowly, going nowhere visible, while the casualty lists keep arriving and the newspapers keep turning. This is exactly what Grant's critics predicted. He is just another general who cannot beat Lee. His victories in the West were flukes. His grand plan has fallen apart. Sigel routed, Banks humiliated, the coordinated offensives in ruins, and after spending 50,000 men in a month, he has produced not a victory, but a siege. Within Washington, there are quieter, more uncomfortable whispers. Some of Grant's commanders know that the attrition strategy critics are attacking has never been purely his design. Political pressure and decisions made above his level, including Lincoln's reliance on politically connected generals in the Valley and on the Red River, have gutted the original plan before it could work. Grant is absorbing blame for failures that are not entirely his to own. Grant knows this. His staff knows it. But Grant does not say it. He writes to Halleck he will not become the critic of the president. He tells his staff it is not the place of a good soldier, to publicly question the orders or policies of those above him. He will carry the weight of the campaign, absorb what needs to be absorbed, and not protect his own reputation at the expense of the administration's stability. If Lincoln needs him to be the lightning rod, he will be the lightning rod. In letters to his wife, Julia, during this period, there are no rants about political interference, no long complaints about the newspapers, no bitterness about the accusations. Instead, the letters ask about the children, about whether money is reaching her, about why she hasn't been writing more. "Why don't you write oftener?" he asks her in one letter. A general commanding hundreds of thousands of men, overseeing a campaign that will determine the fate of the Republic, asking his wife for more letters home. He does not say he is struggling. He doesn't have to. Through the summer and autumn of 1864, while newspapers are writing Grant's obituary and peace Democrats are using his casualty figures as campaign ammunition, something else is happening. Something that will take years for the public to fully understand. Petersburg is not a failure. It is a vice. Every week Grant holds Lee at Petersburg, Lee's army bleeds a little more. Confederate desertions accelerate, supplies thin, The men in the Confederate trenches receive smaller rations, less ammunition, fewer replacements. Lee's army, the finest fighting force in the Confederacy has ever produced, is being slowly, methodically strangled. It cannot go on offense. It cannot maneuver. It can only sit inside its earthworks and hemorrhage. And it is not just Petersburg. In August 1864, Sheridan takes command in the Shenandoah Valley and proceeds to devastate it, burning crops, destroying rail lines and mills, turning the breadbasket that has been feeding Lee's army into scorched earth. In September 1864, Sherman captures Atlanta. The news arrives in the North like a thunderclap, giving Lincoln's re-election campaign the dramatic victory it desperately needs. Lincoln wins in November. The Democrats, who have been using Grant's casualty figures as their primary argument against continuing the war, lose. The negotiated peace that would have recognized Confederate independence does not happen. In Georgia, Sherman begins his march to the sea in November 1864, cutting through the Confederate heartland and demonstrating that the Confederacy cannot protect its own interior. In January 1865, Fort Fisher falls to Union forces, closing Wilmington, the last major Confederate port, and severing the final supply line keeping Lee's army alive. Grant has not designed all of this alone. He is not omnipotent, and the war does not go entirely according to any single plan, but the concept he brought to the job in March 1864. Apply pressure everywhere simultaneously, squeeze until something breaks is, despite the disasters on the Red River and in the valley, exactly what is happening. The Confederacy is not losing a single battle. It is running out of everything at once. The public is reading obituaries for Grant's career. Grant is reading maps of the roads to Appomattox. Cold Harbor has cost him something permanent. The label Butcher will follow him into the presidency, into his post-war years, into the history books. Critics in the decades after the war will hold up those few minutes on June 3rd as proof of his cruelty, his wastefulness, his fundamental lack of the tactical imagination Lee supposedly always possessed. Later, historians do what journalists in 1864 do not have the time or inclination to. They run the numbers. The results are uncomfortable for the simple narrative of Grant as Butcher. Across his major campaigns, Grant's armies typically lose a lower percentage of their strength than Lee's do. In the Overland Campaign alone, Grant loses roughly 55,000 men out of about 120,000, around 45%, which Lee loses about 33,000 out of 65,000 more than half his starting force. One analysis of Lee's full career estimates that an average of around 20% of his troops were killed or wounded in his major campaigns, totaling more than 120,000 casualties, more than any other Civil War general. Lee's army bleeds faster than Grant's. The general celebrated for saving Confederate lives is, by the arithmetic, losing a higher share of his men than the general being called a butcher. Grant's attrition strategy is, in the cold accounting of military history, less costly than Lee's way of war. But statistics do not close wounds. They do not bring back 6,000 men lost in a few minutes at Cold Harbor. They do not undo the grief of families who receive a name pinned to the inside of a uniform instead of a living man. What history offers instead is a paradox. The worst year of Grant's public life is also the year that makes his victory inevitable. The campaign that nearly destroys his reputation is the campaign that finally fixes Lee in place, bleeds the Confederacy beyond the point of recovery, and makes Appomattox not just possible, but unavoidable. He is written off as a butcher in June. By April of the following year, Lee is putting on his finest dress uniform to ride to a farmhouse and surrender. Epilogue: The Weight of the Name. Grant publishes his memoirs in 1885. He writes them while dying. Throat cancer, the legacy of decades of cigars, the same cigars that the Northern public sent him by the thousands after Vicksburg. When a newspaper reported he had been smoking during the battle, the public wanted to give him something. He accepted it. The irony takes 30 years to arrive. He writes the memoirs quickly, racing the disease, finishing the manuscript days before he dies. They are remarkable documents, clear, precise, almost entirely free of self-pity, structured by the same mind that designed the Overland Campaign on a map. And in those pages, Grant does not spare him Cold Harbor. He names it. He says it plainly. The one order of the war he most wishes he could take back. For a man who spent his career absorbing blame without public complaint, without shifting responsibility, without attacking Lincoln's policy or explaining his own constraints, that admission is extraordinary. It is also characteristic. He states the fact, records the regret, and moves on. He does not perform remorse. He does not linger. He simply writes it down because that is what happened, and he is not in the business of pretending. The rehabilitation of his reputation does not come quickly. The lost cause myth. The idea that Lee was a tactical genius undone only by overwhelming Northern numbers and resources, requires Grant to remain the butcher. The myth needs an opposite for Lee to be defined against. Someone graceless where Lee is noble. Someone crude where Lee is dignified. Someone who spends lives recklessly where Lee supposedly preserves them through brilliance. The record argues otherwise. The numbers argue otherwise. The strategy argues otherwise. But myths are not defeated by numbers, and the emotional power of Cold Harbor, of thousands of men down in minutes, is not something quantitatively assessment fully dissolves. What is left, if you strip away both the myth of the butcher and the myth of the infallible general, is something more interesting than either. A man who designs a strategy to end the war, watches most of it collapse through no fault of his own, and then grinds forward anyway, through the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg, because he understands, even when the public does not, that what looks from the outside like a brutal stalemate is from the inside a stranglehold. He is despised in June of 1864 by the same newspapers that will celebrate him in April of 1865. His darkest year and his finest year are the same year. Somewhere in those 11 months between crossing into Virginia and the farmhouse at Appomattox, between the fires in the dark and the handwritten note that stops the war, there is something worth sitting with. About what leadership looks like from the inside when the outside is unrecognizable. About what it costs to keep moving when everyone around you has decided you're finished. About the gap between what a thing looks like in the moment and what it turns out to have been. About a general who asks his wife why she doesn't write more often, and then gets up the next morning and looks at his maps. Subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you soon.